Shining Force is Sega's more accessible, faster-paced, and all-around cooler answer to Nintendo's Fire Emblem.
Why you boring me? I'm right.
You're not going to believe me, but as a tactical RPG fan, Shining Force versus Fire Emblem is like arguing about the differences between Sonic and Mario. It's the same genre, and both are good, but damn, one of them tickles something special inside of me. Obligatory warning, not to mention Sonic and tickling too close together, or you'll get metadated into some really frightening places. They share some historical DNA too, in that there was this lengthy period of time where these tactical RPGs were not the biggest thing in the world, and both series kind of languished while still existing and being liked by a very particular brand of weirdo. For Fire Emblem, this manifested in that little stretch where despite finally coming to the West, it remained niche enough that it was at risk of being pushed into the same closet at Nintendo where F-Zero is kept.
Yes!
For Shining Force, however, it was a little different. See, there hasn't been a tactical RPG called Shining Force whatever since 1998's Shining Force 3 in the United States. Because the series isn't really Shining Force. It's just Shining. Shining Force is the tactical RPG sub-series of the larger Shining franchise, which includes two mini action RPGs and a whole bunch of B-string releases that never even got localized. Meanwhile, Fire Emblem has like 20% of the Smash Ultimate roster. I'm happy for Fire Emblem. I am. My homies in Serene's Forest know what's up. But Fire Emblem is not Shining Force. Yes, sometimes it feels like the difference is only legally distinct, but something about those 3 or 4 tactical games in a row is just magical. The building world and fiction, the character designs, the music, they were onto something back then. I think they should take another crack at it now that we know you just have to put hot anime people in it and you can have all the success in the world. I think now that Fire Emblem has had its day in the sun, Sega should just do what they did the first time. Look at Fire Emblem as a template, go, cool, let's make one of those, and then do it the Sega way. Which is taking the core conceit of a thing and adding some funk on top of it. Like, what can we do to make our own version of the waifu-era social tactical game? What can we take from other games that have these elements that have come out in the time since the last Shining Force? They own Persona now. Like, just go have a meeting of the minds with that team for a week. Do some team building exercises. Let them drink together and talk about games they like after work on a little retreat. Can you imagine what we might get out of that? And that's not to say the old Shining team didn't have chops. The original team eventually broke off from Sega and formed Camelot, meaning that these guys made Mario Golf. And to be honest with you, that means that their general decision-making is beyond reproach. Remember when Fire Emblem Fates came out, and it was so weird because it was this massive strategy game kind of spread across 3 games? Yeah, dude, check this out. It's called Shining Force 3 Scenario 1. And here are its younger siblings, Scenario 2 and Scenario 3. These games came out in 1998. And they do that. But you wouldn't know it because Sega never bothered to translate these two or mention them. In fact, Sega doesn't like to mention any of the Shining games, which, alright, some of these action RPGs, sure, we can forget about those, but these strategy ones are actually good. Sega has great games in its closet, and loves to be all brandy about, haha, Sonic is from the 90s, and haha, remember Knights? And they still won't do anything cool with Shining Force. But Camelot's still around. You could give them Shining Force now and see what they do with it. Imagine what it would be like if Camelot got to return to making real RPGs and the project they began with was a remake of Shining Force. You know what? Let's imagine it together. Here's my thinking. First of all, we look at this as a reboot and a remake. Yes, I know. It's the it thing right now. They're probably doing it in-house at Sega right this second, actually. But the fact of the matter is, We can't suffer the slings and arrows of having to adhere to whatever loose lore has been cockamamie'd about with for 30 years. We have to admit that Shining, as it stands, is not particularly successful or with it. I know it hurts and I hate to say it too, but let's face it. You're not watching some obscure guy on YouTube talk about Shining Force if you don't already love Shining Force. We are a minority Shining Force fans. There are dozens of us.
Dozens!
So let's go back to Shining Force 1. We can take the simple plot of the original and use that to our advantage, taking the broad strokes and using those again in our new game. So what's the situation?
Yes.
We've got 2 lands in a fantasy setting. There's a good guy land called Rune, and a bad guy land called Rune Faust. We've got a big gate that holds in an even bigger evil called Dark Dragon. The gate is in the good guy land. The bad guy land wants to open the gate, let out the dragon. So, the bad guy land invades the good guy land, and the heroes are overwhelmed. Those heroes are the player and any party members in their army, and we call them the Shining Force, you see. So, the Shining Force has to go around the world, gaining allies and looking for assistance. All so they can somehow overcome the odds and beat back the bad guys and the dragon, and by so doing, save the world. It's a tale as old as time. We can safely remake a story this generic and make it more interesting without messing with the original. Shining Force is not respected for narrative, so this is one of the places we can really improve while still appealing to series fans as our audience base. Hey, we're doing the thing you like, and trying to bring in new people with a fresh start. But today's gamers are slovenly idiots who cannot think critically about the media they engage with, so we can't rely on our story to be satisfying. We have to think about the mechanical aspects of the game and how we can make those subtly interesting so that fat nerds will make video essays about the mechanics and why this is the best Shining Force ever, and so on and so forth. There's this fascinating piece/interview from a defunct UK magazine called Games TM with a director on all 3 original Shining Force games. That's Hiroyuki Takahashi. First off, rest in peace to another real one murdered by Future Publishing.
One for me, and one for my homies.
Second, the piece sheds a lot of light on the development behind Shining Force and the relationship between the development team and Sega itself. Information that directly contradicts the Wikipedia pages for Takahashi and Shining Force that both reference it multiple times. It's almost like nobody actually reads things. This includes me because it straightens some things out for me. Namely, Fire Emblem was not the driving motivator behind Shining Force. In the interview, Takahashi claims that Fire Emblem had 0 influence on Shining Force, but honestly, that's hard to believe. Even if we take him at his word that the pacing of the game was so bad that he didn't want to play it, that implies a world where spite is not a motivator, and frankly, I don't want to live in that world. However, something else he said really stuck out to me. Takahashi is quoted, "I was thinking, I wonder if there's any way we can take the battles from Dragon Quest and make them more fun." And you know what? This comparison to Dragon Quest is doing something for me. It adds context to the gameplay loop in Shining Force in such a way that I feel foolish for not seeing the DNA before it was spelled out for me. That's DNA. Both of the critically different gameplay mechanics that set Shining Force apart from its contemporary strategy RPGs come directly from Dragon Quest. What are those mechanics? 1, no game over. And 2, exploration segments between battles. Let's break that down. In Shining Force, you lose a battle if the leader of the Shining Force, the character that the player controls between battles, is defeated. But instead of a game over, you're just warped back to the last town you visited prior to the battle itself. This is never explained, but it isn't a true reset either. Any party members who were defeated in the battle have to be resurrected to be used again, a service which, much like Dragon Quest, requires a payment in cold, hard gold. The exchange is that any golden experience you earned from the battle before your defeat are retained as well. So you can kind of throw yourself against a battle until you eventually overcome it, even if it is a matter of attrition. Every loss will net you some gold and experience, which will help you either resurrect characters to earn more in the next attempt, buy items to aid in the next attempt, or generally become more powerful ahead of the next attempt. It's all about that next attempt, though. Trying again. Shining Force doesn't punish you for losing so much, but it will make you work for your eventual victory if you're careless. Comparatively, classic Fire Emblem had permadeath for characters, or a system in which characters who are defeated in battle are ostensibly killed and unusable in your campaign from there. Though characters important to the story will still appear in scenes between battles as if they were not dead, the time between battles is also host to story scenes without wandering around. It's an ongoing war story, much like Animorphs. There's no time for stopping and smelling the roses. That is, until you get to modern Fire Emblem, post-Awakening, and realize that, oh, they've just kind of been adding some Shining Force mechanics all along. I mean, now you can have a tea party with your favorite anime characters in the midst of an actual war. That's fun! It's not quite the exploration of multiple towns and environments that Shining Force featured, being instead limited to the specific hubs that you return to most of the time, but I wouldn't be surprised if we saw that kind of exploration eventually work its way into Fire Emblem. Depending on how Intelligent Systems and Nintendo feel about the performance of the slightly more traditional Fire Emblem Engage, as opposed to its direct predecessor Three Houses, we might see something like that as soon as the next Fire Emblem. But that's not an accusation, it's an observation. Games borrow from each other and build off of concepts and conceits that other teams invent. It's part of what keeps the industry interesting. So while I can't point to anything that says, oh hey, Fire Emblem totally copied some ideas from Shining Force, because Nintendo specifically likes to not acknowledge video games they haven't made, I can gesture suggestively and say, hey, isn't this an interesting point of comparison? So, if we were going to bring back Shining Force, what could we borrow from strategy RPGs that have come out since? The big one I already kind of alluded to. It's the social element that has made Fire Emblem a big part of Nintendo's modern lineup. See, since Awakening, Fire Emblem has had a bunch of waifu mechanics, and like it or not, I personally do. That part of the game is what has hooked more players. There's an engaging element to pairing up characters you like, basically in-game shipping, and seeing how their relationships develop. Sometimes they fall in love or get married and have children that are put in the baby realm off-screen so they can age up and join the fight. It's not super important how we get those new characters on the battlefield, but it is important that we introduce new characters so that the game as a whole can be a more full and interactive experience. Not every player will recruit every character, ideally, so having an abundance of recruitable characters will ensure different players use different teams on the battlefield. Now this is where it gets sticky, because there's a subset of players who definitely exist online and will vocally not like anything being different. The more we change, the more we risk upsetting that vocal minority, and we're already going to be changing quite a lot just to have a developed story and characters that are interesting enough to want to interact directly with in a social context. In the original Shining Force, the characters you meet along the way and have join your army are all essentially one note. You get archetypes and not characters. A cowardly archer, a short but effective fighter, a mage who is also a girl. These sorts of wild ideas. That's not going to fly in the 21st century, not if we want to make a game that's worth more than being a time waster. Yes. If we're implementing social mechanics, whatever they may look like, then we need characters that players will want to socialize with. Now, this simultaneously plays into our hand and doesn't. On the positive end of the spectrum, we have a general blueprint for a bunch of characters. We can take our cowardly archer and expand on that concept. Why is he cowardly? What has he seen? Is his cowardice played seriously, as in a result of being a person fighting in a war? Or is it played for laughs and he is afraid of everything? Either is a valid approach, and the general tone we go with in the game will determine which is more appropriate. With characters that have one-note personalities in the original game, it's easy to expand on those notes to compose full songs with them. But introducing new characters, especially if they are somehow related to the old ones, risks us heading into territory I like to call the sequel trilogy problem. You see this a lot in legacy sequels. A character who is the son or daughter of a character from the original work shows up and is either a carbon copy of the original character or has nothing really at all to do with them, and their relationship is sort of forced in there just to connect back to something old, because their creative director said they had to. Naturally, both of these outcomes are bad. We don't want to just introduce a new character who is a cowardly archer and say he's related to our original cowardly archer. At that point, why bother introducing a new character at all? We still have Cowardly Archer. We don't need a second Cowardly Archer that will dilute the one we already have and make it so that neither character is actually all that appealing at the end of the day. So, how do we walk that line and balance these new characters so that they're interesting? My suggestion? Design them first as one-note characters that you could see fitting into the original Shining Force. Imagine our task was to re-release the Genesis game with new content. That's not what we're doing, but I think the philosophy is sound. If we come up with logical ways for characters to fit into the blueprint we already have, then we can expand on them later, much like we're already doing with the characters that are present in the original game. This way, we avoid the overlapping of archetypes that form the core of these characters. We can use relationships to springboard into ideas for how these new characters can differ from the old. It's kind of like a narrative exercise version of Nintendo building out ideas for Breath of the Wild by framing it within the context of the original Legend of Zelda. As an example, let's say that our social mechanics involve a straight rip of what Fire Emblem Awakening offered. Characters can pair up and produce offspring that somehow get involved in our fight. We can worry about the logic behind this later, find a way for it to work narratively, but first, we need to determine how it works mechanically. Let's say that each member of the Shining Force has one potential child character that will appear when they pair up with another character. This is how it works in Awakening, with the mother determining which child you get and the father determining some small things like the color of their hair or whatever. Using the original Shining Force as a blueprint, there are a potential 30 characters that can join your army. The diversity of character types is broader than Fire Emblem, but there is a distinct gender discrepancy, which kind of throws our potential offspring angle out the window. For reference, out of the 30 characters, 21 are male, 7 are female, and the last 2 are what I call little weirdos, who maybe shouldn't be considered eligible for breeding. In fact, breeding clearly isn't the answer here, and we've got a little diversity problem on top of that. Call me crazy, but if our intention here is to make an all-time classic strategy RPG, we need characters who are going to connect with all sorts of people. As it stands, our default roster is a bit of a sausage fest. Now, that's not to say gender is a characteristic that we have to strike a balance with in every creative project ever, but I do think that the scale is so weighted to one side over the other that we should look at it critically and consider how we can expand on it. I suggest that we want something that touches on more kinds of lives and lived experiences both inside and outside of the fantasy world we're building for the game. More women, characters that exist outside of the gender binary, etc. This sort of talk will frustrate people, and at least one dork will say we're going woke, but even if we are entirely pragmatic about this, it's a good idea. More kinds of people play games and more of them than they did in 1992. We have to acknowledge that. We have to adapt to that. A positive side effect of this choice is that maybe more people will feel like they can identify with particular characters in our game. And if we write them well enough, even characters that don't necessarily line up with the lived experiences of certain players can touch those players in such a way that maybe the game makes them learn or consider something new. Is this the point of our remake? No, not necessarily. But it is cool and expression of business while simultaneously being kind of an ethically right thing to do. This does not happen very often, so let's embrace it. Okay. So we want more characters of more variety, but our child idea is out the window from both a sensibility standpoint and, let's be honest, creatively, it was a little bankrupt to just turn to Fire Emblem and do that. Apparently that wouldn't be keeping in spirit with the original either, so let's go with that reasoning too. What can we do? Here's my fanfiction. The title of Shining Force is technically Shining Force: The Legacy of Great Intention. This doesn't really mean anything in the original story, it's just a reference to the fact that the characters are fighting a bad guy who was also the bad guy 1,000 years ago. Our Shining Force is not the first Shining Force, it's a new group using an old name. There's a time concept here, which, yes, is also the case in Fire Emblem Awakening. I think we take this in one of two directions to give ourselves free reign to introduce more characters. Option 1. Time travel. We introduce a conceit similar to Awakening, but in reverse. Instead of children from the future coming back in time to aid the Shining Force, we have members of the original Shining Force from 1,000 years ago getting sent through time to the present to help. I think there's enough potential in this idea that we should consider using it as the backstory for one new character, even if we don't use it as a blanket way to introduce more. Option 2, fame. Because the Shining Force is the entity that defeated Dark Dragon 1,000 years ago, and that history is pretty well known, the fact there's a new group calling itself the Shining Force is going to attract a lot of attention. People are going to take note as they blow through town. We can just create more recruitable NPCs that can be dotted around the various towns and environs the player explores. We have to build these out a little differently if we're looking to translate the 2D town maps into something more modern, so we'll need characters to populate the larger spaces anyway. Personally, I'd go with option 2. It's simpler, and it has way less potential to introduce holes into whatever our final plot looks like. However, I do think that at least one character should somehow have been part of the original Shining Force. Maybe it's the leader, and they offer advice or criticism to you based on your performance in battle. Maybe there's a hard ass that eventually warms up to those darn kids that are using the old club's name. We can pull a character at a time any old way we please, and I think that we should do it. Whichever option we go with is gonna tie into our title pretty well. It's a legacy, in the literal sense. Either the characters that started that legacy are going to interact with the characters carrying it on, or characters will want to be a part of that legacy and join based on that desire.
And now for something completely different.
Listen, let me take a step back here from quite literal armchair game design. I know that there are 0 people who have any say in what a corporation invests in that also watch this YouTube channel. I'm not delusional. However, maybe somebody who sees this and has more influence than me, a very low bar, says, hey, that fat nerd is right. We should have more Shining Force content. And maybe they tell somebody, or get seen by somebody even bigger. And then it goes on up and on up the ladder until even the Pope knows that we need a new Shining Force. And isn't that the American dream, really? To stand up and say what you believe in, even if some guy in a red coat is telling you not to. To make the smallest of possible stands, so that a mega corporation somewhere will make one funny little thing to score some easy goodwill points from consumers. Show up on the front page of some gamer website that sucks, and see a very specific sales boom somewhere for something. May I suggest a line of Shining Force-inspired candles? I believe that it is the American dream. And from where I'm sitting, in a consumerist hell, surrounded by tchotchkes I've bought, fashioned after things I like, to distract me from the fact that all of life is really just in service of an evil system I cannot change in any way, that it is a dream fully worth pursuing. So stand with me, fellow fat nerds. Stand with me and say, I would really like it and probably put some money down if Sega gave me some kind of thing that said Shining Force on it. I mean, no promises. It kind of depends heavily on what the thing is and how much they charge for it. I mean, the candle thing is cute and functional, but if you want more than like $10 for a candle and a PNG of the Shining Force logo, then you're insane. And say it proudly.